Following the disastrous campaign by Hull in early 1812 in the Great Lakes region, culminating in the siege and fall of Fort Detroit that ended the first invasion of Canada, the Americans moved on to their second point of the invasion, in the Niagara region. Their objectives were to hold the British forces and isolate Upper Canada. They launched this invasion on October the 13th. Its first objective was to take Queenston Heights, the bluffs above the Niagara River and south of Lake Ontario, then moving on to their final objectives of cutting the portage trail between Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, cutting the supply lines, then moving on to the town of Queenston itself. The regulars in turn would go to take Fort Detroit, attacking it from the weak landward side. The entire invasion was a feint to hide the real invasion that was happening in the upper St. Lawrence and Lake Champlain region. The Americans were led by Major General Stephen Van Rensselaer, an inexperienced political general. Oddly enough, he was a Federalist. He was helped by his cousin, Lieutenant Colonel Solomon Van Rensselaer, who had some military experience. In order to complete his objectives, he was given roughly 1,000 militia from New York, a large number of whom were unarmed and inexperienced, leaving them exposed to attack. Luckily enough for the Americans, Sir George Prevost called for a temporary ceasefire on the northern frontier to send supplies to the British troops in Spain and Portugal. General Dearborn, the supreme commander of the American forces, accepted it, but Madison declined it. This disagreement caused the ceasefire to be short. Both the British and Americans used the time of the ceasefire to move troops and supplies along their front lines. The ceasefire ended on August the 19th. Van Rensselaer's troop expanded to 2,560 militia and 600 regulars during the ceasefire. As Van Rensselaer was a Federalist, his troop staff and some newspapers were suspicious of his lack of action, and so, after the truce ended, General Dearborn sent General Smythe, an even less successful political general, and the Inspector General of the American forces, to watch over him. While he was there, he messed up Van Rensselaer's plans for the invasion. To start with, he didn't even show up, but sent a letter instructing that the crossing of the Niagara should happen at the southern end between Fort Erie and Chippewa, though he closed the letter by saying that these orders would change if new information was provided, but any further attempts to contact him were evaded. This, combined with Smythe's lack of knowledge of the terrain, forced Van Rensselaer to ignore his orders and attacked Queenston as he planned anyway, on October the 10th with the troops he had around Lewistown. This includes the aforementioned 2,650 militia and 600 regulars, now fully supplied after the ceasefire. The invaders made their way to the crossing points, in a rainstorm that turned the roads into little more than bogs, only to find that the boats that they were planning to cross on were gone. The soldiers, upon arriving, were annoyed to say the least, and so instead of calling a council of war to make up a new plan, Van Rensselaer rescheduled the same plans to the 12th and made some slight adjustments. Smythe sent some reinforcements from Fort Niagara and Black Rock, which included 300 men, 13th Infantry, and 2 companies of the 2nd Artillery Regiment, commanded by Winfield Scott. These reinforcements were force-marched in the same road conditions as the troops under Van Rensselaer, only arriving just before the battle. With the roads being so bad, the crew of the artillery struggled to get to the destination during their forced march to Lewistown Heights to cover the crossing of Van Rensselaer's forces. The first wave of Americans crossing the river were 300 militia and 300 regulars under the command of Solomon. The cannons were to follow them as soon as the infantry secured the landing. The decision to choose his cousin to command the first crossing wasn't popular with the commanders of the regulars, who believed they had more combat experience, but in reality, their combat experience was about the same. The militia supported Solomon's command, though through the eagerness or nervousness of first combat, and so the decision was made. There were not enough boats organized for the crossing. Only 100 boats were available to make the crossing, allowing only 600 men to cross at the same time, causing a disorganized traffic jam of troops on the American side of the river during the battle. This was mainly due to nobody being in charge of the boarding and crossing of troops. This was not helped by the river being rougher and faster than usual due to the recent rain. This would prove crucial in the battle when Van Rensselaer wanted to move in Captain James Gibbons' light artillery company, but could not as the boats were too small for his 6-pounders. After solidifying his command, Solomon put Stephen Van Rensselaer's plans into action. Solomon kept said plans to himself, and most of his subordinates didn't know their objectives. In the meantime, Brock knew about the failed crossing and was nervous that it was a feint for an attack elsewhere. This was supported when on October the 12th, when the brigade leader at Fort George went across the Niagara River to do a prisoner exchange under a flag of truce. Upon meeting the American representatives, asked for Van Rensselaer himself, but he was told that Van Rensselaer was ill and thus not available for this transaction by Van Rensselaer's secretary, named Took, as well as any progress trying to make the prisoner exchange happen regardless, was countered by the secretary saying it would be made the day after tomorrow. Also, whilst this meeting was going on, the brigade leader saw boats hidden under the bushes by the shore, and so once he gave up upon the prisoner exchange, he reported his findings to the council of officers. They responded with laughter and mockery, though after the meeting, Brock told him he was convinced of the possibility, and so that evening he ordered the militia to assemble. The British and native forces numbered 2,000 men, including the 41st and 49th Regulars, including 300 Grenadiers and light companies of the 49th, supported by the Lincoln County militia and artillery, halfway up the heights, south of the village of Queenston, and an 18-pounder at Queenston itself, defending Romans Point. The recent victory at Fort Detroit encouraged more militia and native warriors to the fight. Brock suspected that this was a feint to attack Fort George, so most of the regulars were concentrated at the fort itself, under the command of Major General Sheffey, and Brock himself was in the Niagara headquarters. The Americans assembled at the dispatch points at midnight on October the 13th and waited until 3 a.m. when the order to begin the assault was given. During the crossing, a boat with a colonel of the regulars, oarlocks, broke, and they were swept downstream. Fortunately for them, they ended up on the American side of the river. Two other boats shared a worse fate when they were swept downriver and landed on the British side of the river and were captured by Canadian militia. These three boats were out of commission, only worsening the traffic jam on the American side of the river. The other three boats crossed without incident. As the boats took off from the landing to pick up the second wave of forces, the British sentries were alerted and raised the alarm. The first to respond was James Dennis's Grenadiers, who poured fire from a nearby heights onto the massive, still organizing American troops. Solomon took 6 bullets and fell, but not dead. He was unconscious, alongside 8 dead officers and 45 dead soldiers. Then the British artillery began to fire their 18-pounder at the American invaders, who were now in disarray due to losing so many of their troops, until Johnny Wool of the 13th Infantry formed a line of the various regiments in the landing and returned fire, forcing the outnumbered Grenadiers from the ridge and back to the town of Queenston, saving the beachhead. But the landing was still under heavy artillery fire from the town. Solomon, who was still vaguely conscious when asked for orders, said to take the heights ahead of them. Due to the river curling the heights could not be surrounded, and so the Americans would have to do a frontal assault. All looked grim for the American forces attacking the heights until a lieutenant from the artillery by the names of John Gonzafort, who knew of a fishing trail that went along the face of the cliffs that led to the top of the heights, let Wool know. Given no other option, Wool took the risk and sent the majority of his forces up the Fisherman's Path, leaving 100 men to pin the Grenadiers to that ridge. The troops that went up the Fisherman's Path found themselves at the top of the heights, behind the 18-pounder guns and General Brock himself. General Brock, who had earlier woken up to the sound of the artillery fire at Queenston, took his horse down the river, ordering whatever troops he came across to follow him as soon as possible. He rode to the top of the heights where the 18-pounders were to oversee the battle. He was there until Wool's troops arrived, at which point the artillerymen spiked the guns, disabling them, and they and Brock withdrew to Queenston. Once they got there, Brock organized whatever troops that met him at Queenston to retake the heights. Leading the charge personally, outnumbered the charge faltered, and Brock rallied them, yelling, quote, "This is the first time I've seen the 49th turn their back. Surely the heroes of Egmont will not tarnish their record." End quote. This is referring to the Battle of the War of the Second Coalition when the British and Russians invaded Holland, and with this, reinforced by 2 militia companies, he led a second charge, but during the charge, Brock was shot in the chest by a U.S. rifleman. There are many words and phrases that are attributed to Isaac Brock's last words. On one account he says, "Push on, brave York volunteers," end quote, talking about a militia company he liked or preferred. Or "Push on, don't mind me," a very British stiff upper lip interpretation. And even, forgive my Latin, I don't speak it, and even "Surgite," Latin for push on, which is now the motto for Brock University. But the charge began to falter once more after Brock fell, so Lieutenant Colonel John MacDonald and 50 men rushed the heights to avenge Brock and to retake the battery, but could not maintain the charge, and MacDonald and his horse were both killed. Captain John Williams of the 49th Light Company was wounded. Dennis of the Grenadiers withdrew with the survivors to Romans Point and rallied them on the edge of Queenston. As the light of the morning, the accuracy of the British artillery became more and more accurate, sinking more of the boats crossing the river, killing or washing the troops down the river, to be drowned, to become uncaptured, such as Lieutenant Colonel Fenwick, who was captured when washed down the shore, badly wounded. At 7 a.m., Christie arrived to the scene of confusion, which was the fighting happening around the landing. Some of the troops were fighting Dennis's Grenadiers for the heights, while others were moving towards Queenston itself, though not much is recorded about the fighting around the village of Queenston. The American 3-pounders were having little effect on the British while giving supportive fire. Christie reported that he saw Stephen Van Rensselaer, who requested that Smythe come to Lewiston with reinforcements, and gave Winfield Scott command of the troops on the heights. Following him at 10 a.m., the commander of the engineers, Joseph G. Totten, with Brigadier General Williams Wadsworth of the New York Militia, to give his troops encouragement. This man is sort of a George Patton of sorts. So when we say encouragement, we mean yelling at these poor buggers. If you don't know what I mean, look up George Patton's rallying speeches in North Africa. Anyways, Van Rensselaer told Christie and Totten to go with him to the heights, with word of reinforcement, ammunition, and entrenching tools, to get to them as soon as possible. Gibson managed to eventually get his 6-pounder across the river and onto the heights, although it had little ammunition. Scott and Totten with 600 soldiers entrenched themselves on the heights, while Wool and the other wounded in the assault were taken to the boats. At this time, the British got their reinforcements from the fort. They were mostly regulars, and this must have been a terrifying sight for the inexperienced, untrained militia, who by this point in the fighting had been fighting since midnight the previous day. Both sides were tired and hungry and running low on ammunition. Scott was promised reinforcement, but they would not come. This especially hurt the Americans, as men were leaving the battlefield wounded, didn't return despite the Patton-esque encouragements that I mentioned before, that Wadsworth shouted at the militia. Small numbers of militia began to trickle away to the landing to never be seen again. By this time Van Rensselaer returned. He noticed that his army's cohesion was completely gone, and his forces were in retreat across the river, except for Scott and Totten on the heights. Whatever reinforcement had arrived at the American side of the river were greeted by the sight of the wounded coming off the boats. Not something you want to see to motivate you to fight. So many of the reinforcements refused to cross the river, and Van Rensselaer wrote a dispatch to Wadsworth, Scott, and Totten that said that there would be no reinforcements. So they had the choice to either stay and face a large force of British regulars with their tired, hungry militia and regulars, or withdraw while they still had a chance. The same letter also said that there would be boats waiting for them when they arrived. This was false, as when they arrived at the landing, they found no boats. The boatmen rowed away as soon as they heard the far-off sound of native war cries, with any militia who were nearby the landing. As British forces approached under the command of Sheffey, Sheffey was a less aggressive commander than Brock, and would not attack until all the odds were in his favor. But with the 41st and 49th, along with fresh detachments including the Black Pioneers under Captain Robert Ranches, which included 25 British African, mainly former slaves, along with 100 mostly Mohawk warriors. The reinforcements added up to about 1,000 men. They arrived at Romans Point, then to Queenston Heights, just east of where Scott, Totten, and Wadsworth's men were, and began to deploy his troops to cover his deployment. To do this, Sheffey sent out the native contingent under the command of John Brandt, Captain Jacob, and a Métis officer, a mixed-race white and native person called John Norton. The yelling warriors burst from the nearby woods along the crest of the heights, but were repulsed by American volleys and a small counterattack by Scott and Christie. Sheffey was now joined by detachments of the 49th and militia from Chippewa, who moved into attack formation, while the artillery and Dennis's Grenadiers on the heights and from Romans Point bombarded the Americans. Mohawk warriors rallied and attacked the Americans' left flank along the river. Once Wadsworth received a letter that said that there would be no reinforcements to be sent, he gathered the militia and regular officers to decide what to do. Keep in mind there were only 125 infantry and 14 artillery men left on the heights, along with 296 militia and regular officers. The militia officers were young men who stayed after their men retreated. Gibson's artillery only had a few shots left, and so the decision was almost unanimous to retreat, while there was still time. The withdrawal began orderly, with Scott leading a rearguard action with the regulars, but this broke down into chaos as men began to stampede to the landing. Some of the men were trampled or fell off the cliff into the river during this. The troops who arrived at the landing discovered the boats that they were promised were not there, and the British and native forces were closing in on them. Surrendering was the only option, and so 2 officers were sent with white flags, but they were both killed by Mohawk warriors. So Scott, Gibson, and Totten went themselves and were nearly killed before the British drove the natives back. It took the British a long time to calm down the native warriors and telling them to stop shooting the Americans. The British captured 958 men at the landing, along with the colors of the militia regiment from New York, and Gibson's 6-pounder. There is no definite number of casualties for the American side, as the militia did not complete their casualty list or were uncertain, and killed or wounded or captured due to many of the troops deserting or drowning counting. Most estimates say that 90 were killed and 150 wounded, 30 of which died of their wounds. The British had 14 killed, 77 wounded, and the natives had 50 killed and 9 wounded, as well as there was an artillery battle between Fort George and Fort Niagara, which produced more casualties that I added to the total mentioned earlier. During this artillery battle between the fort, the Americans abandoned Fort Niagara, but soon rallied and reoccupied it. After being captured, Scott was nearly killed again in the British headquarters by Brent and Jacob, who were still excited after the battle. After the battle, both sides declared a temporary truce to help with the wounded and to bury the dead, as well as exchanging prisoners. The American artillery saluted Brock's funeral on the 16th, 3 days after the battle. Van Rensselaer also sent in his resignation to Dearborn, the supreme commander of the American forces, as Smythe took command of the army. This is the end of the Queenston Heights special. I hope you all have enjoyed. Sources of the information and videos is in the description. If you like the video, give it a thumbs up, and if you like my content, subscribe and click the bell icon to be notified of my next upload. If not, tell me why in the description, or email me at forgottenfronts@gmail.com. I will get to the final episode of the first year of the War of 1812 shortly, after I upload this video. And as always, wherever you are, I hope you're having a good morning, afternoon, or evening. So long for now.